Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Brenda Morris with AFDO, and I'd like to welcome you to our webinar today that's going to be focusing on analyzing legislative proposals. Before we get started, I'd like to introduce you to our presenters who have a great deal of experience in these areas. We have Pamela Miles. Pam, wave your hand. She's a Food Safety Program Supervisor for the Virginia Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services. We have Kim Stryker, who's the Program Manager for Food Safety and Sanitation for the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation. We have Steve Morris, who is the Program Manager for Food Safety and Lodging for the Kansas Department of Agriculture. And we have Steve Mandernock, who's the Executive Director of AFDO and a previous Food Program Director for the Iowa Department of Inspection and Appeals. We look forward to hearing from all of you as we move forward in our presentation. This webinar is the second in a three-part series. AFDO presented best practices for handling budget cuts in the fall of this past year. There's a lot of fundamental information in that webinar that can assist you in preparing and building relationships that are really beneficial during a legislative session. Plans are already in the works to develop a Legislative Process 101 information and resource event about the structure of bills and how it works. So be on the lookout for that. As we get started, I want to let you know that questions can always be entered in the chat box at any time during the presentation, and then we're going to address all of those at the end. Next slide, please. It's important for everyone to understand that each state is different in the structure and terminology that you use in your legislative process. So as we go through this webinar today, if you hear things that may not be familiar or have a different term as in your state, please be sure to just adjust your thinking as you need to for that. This webinar is intended to help you recognize the need to prepare all year long for a legislative session. It also wants to help you understand that the people who introduce legislative proposals, what impact do they particularly have on the proposal? Want to recognize why the proposal has been introduced and help you to better understand how to analyze this and to evaluate the fiscal impacts. When you have an overall comprehensive understanding of the bill and the impacts that it can have on your program, it can help you guide you to the decisions that you need to make. I now want to turn this over to our first speaker, Pamela Miles, and if we can advance to the next slide, please.
Hey Pam, you are muted, so give me 1 second to unmute you. Oh, Pam, you are actually going to have to go unmute yourself. All right, you can go ahead and start over now.
Okay, sorry everyone, I'm talking away, but good afternoon. Today I'm going to quickly touch on how to prepare for the legislative session. Here in Virginia, our General Assembly starts next week, so we are gearing up for our session. Ours is going to be virtual this year. One of the first things you want to do is to understand how the legislative process works in your state. See if there's any training or education that you can take part in to understand exactly how session works in your state. One thing to do in my agency is to provide us with training right before the session starts. They let us know what our roles and responsibilities are going to be during the upcoming session, and this changes from year to year. I can't stress enough how important it is for you to find out your agency's policy on your involvement and communication during the upcoming session. For example, my role is to assist my manager and division looking at the incoming bills coming in and evaluating the bills and looking to see how they can impact our Virginia food laws and/or regulations. I'm responsible for reaching out to our constituents to get their positions on the bill. In addition, assisting with writing talking points for our director and/or commissioner who will attend the committee meetings. You need to be aware, are you going to be responsible for meeting with legislators and going to the committee meetings and speaking on a bill, or is that someone in a more senior role in your agency? Again, I can't stress enough how important it is for you to know ahead of session what your responsibilities will be. And as I said earlier, that role can change from year to year. You need to assist the agency also every week by looking daily and weekly for bills coming in from outside the agency that can impact your program. Next, it is important to know who your legislators are. Make sure you know who your senators, your representatives are, and who the committee and committee members are who will be hearing and voting on the bills. And I mentioned previously reaching out to your constituents to get their position on incoming bills. It is very important to develop these foundational relationships ahead of time before session and throughout the year. Every year, I make sure that I have our constituent list updated with the proper contacts so I know who I am supposed to reach out to get positions on as the bills are coming in. We always have a quick turnaround time. It can be 12 hours, 24 hours, so I have to get the information back to my agency, which I'm sure you all do too when they want positions on it from our stakeholder groups. It's very important to develop relationships with other agencies in your state. This can be very beneficial. Gather with the other agencies or your partner sister agencies before session starts and look at any proposed legislation that they are introducing and how it impacts you and begin discussions. In our state, we work very closely with Virginia Department of Health during session. One other point I want to bring up is we will provide a resource after the webinar where your state's legislative drafting manuals are located. These can be very useful when we're looking at proposals and better understanding why they're written the way they are. Next slide, please. The majority of the proposed bills that we receive each year during session have originated outside of our agency. We've received a large number of food freedom, cottage food bills over the years. Last year, we had bills covering the definition of milk in regard to plant-based milk and PFAS chemicals and packaging materials. Proposed bills come into our agency or all of your agencies, and they originate from special interest groups, consumer groups, trade associations, and sister agencies. You want to make sure that before session that you've built relationships with all your key stakeholders ahead of time so that it can help you be aware of any bills that these groups may be proposing. For example, the Dairymen's Association made our agency aware and met with us to make us aware of a proposed raw milk bill that's going to be introduced. One of our panel members today had mentioned to us that they have held an annual meeting with the stakeholders before session so they would hear of any proposed bills and they could be prepared when the session comes up, and they have open dialogue with and listen to the concerns of their stakeholders so they're prepared before session, and which I'd like to start doing that with our state. And your stakeholder groups can be very instrumental in initiating and supporting bill proposals, and they can also be instrumental in opposing a proposed bill that has significant issues. Lastly, you want to be aware of the proposed bill sponsor. Is the sponsor an advocate of your agency? Are they a new legislator? Has the sponsor not been historically supportive of bills that have affected your food safety program? This is important information to have when you or someone in your agency goes to the committee meetings or meets with the sponsors ahead of time to discuss the proposed bill. Next slide, please. So the purpose. As the proposed bills come in, you want to evaluate each of these bills. What is the proposed legislation trying to solve? Is it actually solving the problem, or could the bill be amended to address the issue? Or can you come up with a compromise or consensus? For example, we've had food freedom bills in the past where these folks were wanting to make any type of food in their home and have the food not be inspected. We met with the groups, came up with some compromise of some low-risk foods that could be made in the home without inspection. And sometimes when bills are introduced, there's no intention to pass a proposal, but to just begin a discussion, as I mentioned with the food freedom folks that we met with. And we have had proposed bills that have not been passed in the past, but work groups have been formed to start the discussions and work on solving these issues. And important to note that not all legislation is intended to be enacted. And it's important to understand that, when you're evaluating the proposal, is this a real problem or is it perceived? And finally, what is the goal of the legislation? And as I mentioned, that we worked with our cottage food operators or home ops in trying to find out what it is that they were trying to do with these bills. Again, determining the purpose of the bill when you're evaluating it is very important. Now to the next presenter.
Can you hear me?
Yes, Kim, we can hear you.
Oh, perfect. Next slide, please. So next, we're going to talk a little bit about the analysis of the bills. And again, as Pam mentioned, I think it's really, really important that you ask yourself, what is the bill trying to do? And does it do what it's trying to do? And does it adequately untangle other areas of the statute that might need to be addressed, other statutes that govern the subject matter? So when you're looking at these bills, one of the first things you want to do is take a look at the bill's sponsor, take a look at the bill's status. Where is it in the process? Are you at beginning of session? Are you end of session? Is it still in committee? Look at some of the legislative deadlines. That's going to be fairly important as well in terms of prioritizing if you've got multiple bills that you're looking at. Make sure you're very familiar with your current statutory code. And also it's very helpful to look at your legislative drafting manual so that you understand some of the language that they're talking about. So one of the first things you want to do is just read the bill through once, then you want to reread it and annotate it. And it might be helpful to you to pull together a complete draft using the current language, because if you've looked at a bill before, sometimes it's pulling different areas of statute into the bill and making changes, suggesting changes to multiple statutes. So sometimes it's helpful to pull it all together, put it into the new language, compare it to the old language, and then take a look at what the strengths and weaknesses of the proposal are. Make sure that you're looking at every single cross-reference. Sometimes there could be some unintended consequences if a particular element of statute is not being proposed to be changed but should be changed, or something is proposed to be changed that maybe shouldn't be. Make sure that you're looking at the appropriate amendment, that you're on the right version of the bill. This as well is incredibly important, as when the bill goes through the process, amendments are typically made. You want to make sure that you're looking at the most current version. You want to make sure that you're looking at the current state policy landscape and evaluating how that bill might fit into the context of that. Are there national models or trends that you need to be aware of? And it's incredibly important that you look at specifically how the bill is going to impact your stakeholders, not just your program and how you run it, but also the consumers, your regulated business owners, employees and people in the workforce. Let's say it's a food worker or education legislation bill. And also look at policy in other states. Might this bill serve as an example that other legislators in other states may want to take a look at? Make sure that if you see any potential sort of loopholes or gaps or ambiguous language, that you are noting those things. And I think really go back to what is the bill aiming to do, and is the bill actually doing that? Next slide, please. I wanted to ask if any of the other members of the panel have anything to add to the analysis, some kind of experience that you'd like to share. So before I turn it over to Steve, one thing I would like to add is just a quick example. Pam mentioned taking a look at the bill and seeing if you could maybe offer alternate language, or you could come up with some sort of a compromise. I'd like to share an example from Alaska with you. We had a bill several years ago that was really kind of one of the first food freedom bills that we had seen. This was almost 10 years ago, I'd say. One of the things that was critical during the process is that we intervened fairly early on with this particular legislator, offering to change our regulations as opposed to waiting until the statute was changed, or hoping that the legislators would take a look and not change the statute too significantly. So we were able to really sort of take the wind out of the sails, so to speak, in terms of changing the language before the legislature had a chance to do it for us. So I'll go ahead and turn it over to you, Steve, to talk about fiscal impacts.
Kim, before we move over to Steve, I just wanted to remind everyone to be thinking, as you get these proposals, also have your list of changes that you would like to see made in your statutes and look at it as an opportunity, because often if it's going to move forward, you may have some willingness of the legislature to fix other things that you might need fixed at the same time. So keep that list and always keep your ideas and use these as opportunities to improve your statute and make those changes you need to make. As you know, it's a lot harder today to get some of those agency type housekeeping matters through the legislature. So use these vehicles as a way of doing that. And I think
That's
Pam,
a great point.
Pam has
Yeah.
something to add also.
I do have something to add. So again, I was just thinking, we're talking about, does this create conflicting laws? Again, I mentioned earlier that we work very closely with Virginia Department of Health, and we had legislation proposed where folks wanted to be able to have their dogs in the tasting rooms of wineries and microbreweries. And it was very important that we work closely with Virginia Department of Health, because it was going to impact them if there was a restaurant in the winery. So you want to make sure, hey, you may not always be thinking, how's this impacting your law, but how's it impacting your sister agency? So we had with that, we also had it with rabbit legislation, where they wanted us to inspect that and kind of do some different changes with rabbits and how that was inspected and what's an approved source. Again, that may affect us as a manufacturer, but how is that impacting Virginia Department of Health and their restaurants? So work closely with your other agencies and make sure that you've discussed this so you guys aren't at odds when you go to the subcommittee meetings or the committee meetings. You want to be on the same page. That's what I wanted to add.
I think that's a really great point, Pam. One of the things that I know that are listed in your resources and you can take a look at after the meeting is an example of a bill analysis that you could potentially use to just capture your thoughts and potential impacts and think about who your stakeholders are, as Pam mentioned. Think about who your sister agencies are and making sure that you're communicating throughout the administration, throughout the executive branch. Any other thoughts, Steve? Okay, well, I'll go ahead and pass this over to Steve to talk about fiscal considerations.
All right, thank you very much, Kim. Just as Kim and Pam have mentioned earlier, the actual content of the bill is very important, but what we find is the actual fiscal impact will cause you probably the most work. So like there was a number of different items to actually think about and like also consider. One is the actual funding mechanism. A lot of time we will receive legislation that has no funding, so a like unfunded mandate. That's something that you do have to work about or worry about, as well as is this funding mechanism a fund? Is it a state general fund? All of these issues about funding may have to be worked out in the bill, or you could also work about getting language into a regulation just to help fund the program or the actual activity involved inside of that bill. So each time there is a bill that is affecting your program or ones that are not even affecting your program, you will be asked for a fiscal note to actually describe what kind of issues will be brought up. One thing I have found is the actual first time you do this, it takes a long time. So like I always keep my most recent fiscal note handy. That way I don't have to do a bunch of remath or finding what all is needed. I can have it based upon the actual last information I had. I can update any type of the information I need, but I don't have to start from scratch, which is at times very helpful because a lot of times during these notes, you have a very short turnaround time. And, there are times that if it's a late breaking issue, it might be just a few hours, or it might be a couple days. One thing to always consider is like any new costly equipment, supplies, resources. I can give you a personal experience. Back in 2009, they moved the actual egg inspections over to the food safety program. Well, I was given the actual responsibility of doing egg inspections, but like I wasn't given any equipment, any training. So I had to go out and I had to explain I needed to buy all new candlers. I had to get our inspectors trained. So like that was all a part of what's it going to cost to actually get this program moved or a change of a law. As well as, will the proposal impact our current work? So, like every one of our programs are working on a very tight budget, and like there is not a lot of excess going on. And if we are going to be adding any type of duties to our staff, either field staff or office staff, like we do have to look at the workload involved and what will have to change, either more people or less of other things. We already talked a little bit about the actual authority to actually collect fees. One thing I will remind everyone is that if a bill does not recommend or say about fees, working with the advisor, working with the author of the bill, talking to them about a way of building those into the bill, or at least adding language to actually let the agency create regulations to actually set a fee if necessary. This next point kind of touched on a previous touch point about how much staff will be needed. When I'm looking at these, I always look at the worst case of how many total people. It is a lot easier to actually overestimate at the beginning and then cut back, compared to giving an amount and then trying to actually go back later and like ask for more funding. So always budget high on this. Just when asked the actual amount of staff you would need, the amount of fees you need, always be looking at, I can always cut back, but I won't probably get a chance to actually ask for more. And staff resources, we have kind of talked about that, but I want to give a prime like example. So you have to look at the total aspect of the bill. What all will be required? It's not only just about the actual inspection being performed, or like what type of license. What type of work is needed inside of your office to actually generate a license, or to have an application filed, and then the paperwork involved in that and the tracking. A while back ago, we here in the department were like giving refunds for just for people that overpaid for a license. Well, some of those people overpaid by $5 or $10. Well, so I started asking the questions: what does it cost our program to actually issue a refund? And like I went outside of our program, so I asked our administrative staff, I asked our fiscal staff, I had our fiscal talk to the state fiscal to just to find out what is the actual cost of like doing a refund. And by the time we added up all of the time in the quarter-hour, like on the quarter-hour increments, it was over $50 to actually send out a refund for $5 or $10. So I bring up this is to say, when you are looking at the cost of a new program or a change in a bill, please look at everything involved. It could be minor, it might be minor on like your side of the house, but like it might affect others inside of your agency. And the final bullet point here, the actual fiscal impact statement on those that the bill applies to. Again, make sure you are covering everything that you may need to do in the future, because odds are you will not get a chance to actually get more money later on. And I would encourage everyone to talk with your chief fiscal officer often about this bill, making sure that everything is covered, because just like once it is final bill, you aren't able to change anything. So, and as Kim mentioned and Pam mentioned, on the fiscal side, even if you need to make changes, go ahead and reach out to the bill author, to the revisor's office, to a legislator, and like offer language. Do not ask to change it, but offer the language that is needed. So that's all I have here. Is there any other comments from the other panelists?
Steve, one other thing I would mention is, use what you've done with the program standards as a tool as you're doing this work too. A lot of your work for Standard 8 really can assist you in doing your fiscal impact statements, because you've already got a lot of those costs sitting there, your FTE needs there, etc. So you can pull some of that information back as you're doing your work. Also think about some of the estimates you've done as you're doing cooperative agreement applications for costs. Those may be things you can use, but also keep all your previous proposals, or essentially fiscal estimates for various things, and use those as a tool to develop the next one. It really helps you as you start getting that catalog of proposals and responses developed. It'll make it much easier to develop those in the future. So just keep all that work that you've done and let it and utilize it, and don't start from the beginning on every single proposal.
All right, thank you, Steve. Kim, I think you might have a comment.
Yeah, I thought I would add to what Steve just said. It's so important that you remember what you've reported in the past, or you remember what you've reported to others, because it comes down to consistency and trust. In case someone wants to pull up something that you provided to them more recently and it's got different numbers on it, it's really important to maintain that trust and make sure that you're being consistent. So I think that's something to really underscore if you're taking notes. Not only are you saving yourself a lot of work and reinventing the wheel, but you're also being consistent as well.
And also document all your assumptions. So what you're using as your basic assumptions, just make sure to document those well, so that you have an understanding of what you did, particularly when you go back in the future and look at it, or when you get asked questions. There could be a lot of these analysis going through during periods of time, and if you don't have good documentation, it can be very easy to be confused. So make sure to write down your assumptions. There may be 5 or 6 assumptions with every bill or more. Make sure to write those down so you know what you used when you were doing this particular item.
All right, thank you both for those comments. As part of your a packet or a email will be sent out after this. One of the things involved or included is a study or a real life analysis or resource just from the state of Texas that will help others when dealing with the fiscal part of the bill. So next, I would like to actually have the next slide, and I turn it over to Steve.
Well, now we just have a handful of tips to look at as you're working your way through the analysis. One of the important things is to understand in your state what various terms mean. For example, shall normally imposes a duty or requirement, may is normally permissive language. But make sure to look at your statutory construction language and to see what different words mean. You have things such as including and such as that may provide examples to help explain what you're doing somewhere, or subject to, or a very important piece of language, notwithstanding means basically contrary to what's already said in law, we're going to do this anyway, and we're going to essentially create an exception. So those things are all very important to understand, and most legislatures will actually, or most codes will actually have a definition section that provides some of these basic definitions in statutory construction. Take a look at your chapter on statutory construction in your code and just have a good understanding of what these words mean. And as you're reading them, make sure that your common meaning is exactly what's meant when they're used in construction. Let's go ahead and move over to the next slide. One of the other things to do is always look at numbers in the proposal and make sure that the number is correct and it makes sense, because when you see numbers, sometimes they can be wrong. Also, along with that, make sure any cross references or references to other code sections are actually accurate and are doing what is intended. Oftentimes that can be confusing, and sometimes the bill drafters aren't necessarily experts in the particular area. On complex language, typically a bill is done in markup and insert format, so it's not showing you the whole context of what it does to a chapter or a section of the code. When you're getting into those complex sections, you may literally need to take the code section and do the markup to figure out how it really reads. Otherwise, you won't have a good understanding of what's happening. It can be very complex without doing that. And that was a tool that I frequently used and found much simpler when we did it, and made the analysis go significantly quicker. It was worth the time to quickly pull that together. The other thing is, as Kim mentioned, is there a regulatory solution rather than a statutory change? I think whenever possible, if there's a regulatory solution, that's normally a better option than doing a statutory change. Think about alternative language. Would there be a better way of doing this that would more directly accomplish this, or may not impact as many other things? Don't be afraid to provide alternative language and a different way of doing this, to either to the folks proposing the bill, the subcommittee or committee that's looking at it, or through your legislative office to the legislator. So think about those sort of things. I mentioned earlier, always think about an opportunity to update a code section. If a bill's impacting a part of the code, think of this as an opportunity to do other fixes, and be looking for those, because that opportunity is very important, because often sections of the code don't get opened up particularly often. So when you have an opportunity to make some amendments there, use those. We found often that some of the bills that we thought were going to be the worst bills proposed ended up being very favorable to us in the end. We were able to do lots of good things and make them and narrow them to that point that it was very worthwhile. I'm just going to go back to a little bit about what everyone said about relationships, though. This is another spot where relationships become really important, because when you have those strong relationships with your constituent groups, they will be your biggest supporters before the legislature, and they'll essentially take your message forward and your talking points forward and say the same thing. And when everyone comes in basically saying the same thing or similar things, it's much easier to improve legislation and make it better. So I do have to say that as we develop those relationships over the years, the first call normally was from the industry group saying, hey, did you see this? What are your thoughts? And that's the way you want it to be. You want to be having those very open dialogues and working collaboratively with your stakeholders in that manner. And we found that to be very effective. And we also found that we developed those relationships of trust, so that we would end up with very similar talking points as we walked into committee and subcommittee meetings, which was very helpful too. One other thing to think about that I didn't mention here is, think about if it's a complex bill, for your purposes, it could be very helpful just to do a quick section by section analysis, just a sentence or two about what each section is doing, so that you have that. And sometimes that's even helpful to provide to the legislators that are working on that bill, because they may not, the subcommittee and committee may not be experts on it. So think about doing that. It's often worth the time for you to do that, and it gives you a reference. One other thing that we talked a little bit amongst the group is, when you're doing these sort of things, if a bill is going to move forward, go ahead and take the time to prepare what I'm going to call a bill binder. So all of the relevant information with this together, well tabbed, well indexed, so you can move quickly when you get questions in those committee and subcommittee meetings and answer them very quickly. Essential things such as the bill itself, the statutory section that it's looking at, any proposed amendments, section by section, all of those sorts of things. On a complex bill, it may be a very large bill book, and on a less complex, it might be a little simpler. But think about doing that, because it sure helps if it's going to move and you're going to have to do those sort of committees and subcommittee meetings. Having that level of preparation makes it go so much smoother. The other thing is, if you walk into the committee and you're able to, and subcommittee, and you're able to answer those questions quickly and provide the information the legislators are asking for in a quick fashion, essentially on the spot as they're asking them, you're going to be considered a trusted source, and you're going to have more influence over them as they're making decisions. So think about all of those things and be very well prepared when those opportunities come. With that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to our other panelists for additional tips that they'd like to add. Kim, do you want to go ahead?
Sure. I just wanted to mention something that I think that maybe I should have mentioned earlier, and that is in Alaska anyway, and I can't speak for every state. Again, it's important to be familiar with your own legislative drafting conventions. But in Alaska, oftentimes or sometimes the legislature will include what they call legislative intent. Or they might have other language that suggests or that tells you that it's not intended to be codified language. So it's not binding language, but it does give you a pretty good idea of what the lawmakers are thinking about and what they intend with that. So that's something as a regulatory agency to pay attention to. The other thing I wanted to mention is we often will have proposals that we'll try to address something like they'll offer a definition of what is a retail food establishment or what is a restaurant. We have definitions in regulatory and our regulations as to what those things. Sometimes they're not consistent. Sometimes they are they conflict with each other, and it's really important to note those things and don't just presume that you're going to keep your regulatory definition if the statute changes it. Then the other thing I wanted to suggest and sort of add on, Steve, to what you were saying is that it's great if you are ultra prepared and you want to go in and be as absolutely prepared as you can be, particularly if you are being asked to provide testimony on a particular bill. However, don't be afraid if you don't know the answer to something or you're just not sure. Don't be afraid to say that and get back with them and get back with them timely. That's going to reflect on you much better than if you made up an answer and you weren't quite correct. So those are my tips to add on to what Steve said. Those are all great points.
Pam? Oh, Pam, you're muted.
Just while Pam is just getting that figured out, I might add that it would be a good idea, especially during the session, is like if you stay in contact with your team that is working the Capitol on and also your legal department. Sometimes they will see bills, but not think of certain programs being affected. So like if you are staying in contact with your administration and legal during the session, they will keep you in mind just like whenever they read a bill that might be affecting your program.
Yeah, I think I'm unmuted now. I wanted to touch on, I mentioned earlier that one of the things that I have to do, one of my responsibilities during session is to help with talking points for the bills. And I just can't emphasize enough how important it is, AFTO, the relationships I've built here, that you have those relationships with other state food safety programs. Everybody on this panel, I have reached out to them every year, I think, during our General Assembly and said, do you have facts? For example, in the food freedom bills I mentioned, the legislators are always asking us, tell us how many foodborne illnesses there have been from foods prepared in the home. So we're looking for that information, but I think it's important that we all share that. And Steve, I don't know if you have anything to say about AFTO, of what resources they have to help with talking points.
Sure. So one of the things, and I think Brenda will hit on it as we end today, is we've been working on some resources and common areas where we're seeing frequent legislation on, and at least developing some basic information about them. We did put out earlier a fact sheet just to provide basic background information as it relates to CBD in particular and how it impacts the food program. So we're doing some of those type fact sheets where we are surveying program managers after the legislative session to find out what happened in various states so that we can help be a resource when you hit those situations and you're looking. So don't hesitate to reach out to myself or Brenda or Pat Kenley when you hit one of those new areas that you're looking for information, and we can see who else has done similar things and get you that information.
Yeah, that's very important and helpful. And we appreciate that, Steve, because we have quick turnaround times. It can be 12 hours, 24 hours. They want it now. They want that information. So it's very helpful. We appreciate that resource. And again, very important to work with your other state partners.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, with that, I think we're going to move to the next slide and move back over to Brenda to facilitate us and move into Q&A.
Okay, thank you guys. So in closing, as we wrap this up, there's some things obviously that we want to remember is before session begins, really make sure that you're staying current with your legislative proposals that are being introduced that are affecting your program. You may want to have somebody that's looking at that on a daily basis to ensure that you don't miss anything. And after session starts, you want to make sure that you are looking at companion bills. Someone is involved in that and keeping you up to date. Evaluate and analyze. That is the key to these new bills and proposals that we're seeing. Make sure you have an understanding of what it is and how it impacts your program. And also look to see if there's any opportunities that can come out of a proposal like they've all spoke on that can benefit you, things you've been holding on that you might be able to throw into any type of change that's coming up. And key is just being thorough in the review and the analysis that you do. So again, I'm going to ask you to go ahead and put any questions you may have in the chat box, and we're going to begin to talk about that. So we'll move on to the next slide and start talking about questions. And if all of my presenters will come back on, we can start asking the questions because you are going to be answering these. So the first one that I'd like to ask is, can you describe in more detail what you mean by creating a new markup version? I did not follow the process or how I would be able to do that myself. So Kim, I may have, go ahead.
I think that was Steve, actually.
Okay,
So
okay.
what we're really talking about is typically legislation is done in strikeouts and inserts format and doesn't take a whole code section or a whole section of the code. So what you literally would do is take the existing code section and then make the changes that are being proposed in the legislation to create what it looks like when they're made. When you're reading strikeouts and inserts, it's just really hard to analyze it. So it makes it much simpler, particularly with those complex. You know, if a sentence or two, it's much easier. But when you hit, 20, 30 page bills, sometimes it's just very hard to do unless you go through and, recreate what would this look like if this passes, essentially is what you're doing.
Okay, thank you. The next question, it says it's not unusual for a poorly conceived, poorly written, misguided, or just plain bad bill to be introduced. Can the panel provide some advice for effectively dealing with such a bill?
Well, I'm just going to start with, this is where your stakeholder relationships can be helpful, because sometimes they can say things you can't say, and I can't tell you how many times those stakeholders killed legislation. The other thing that I would say is if you have good relationships with the key subject matter people in your legislature, sometimes those conversations can end up with bills going in the desk drawer and not moving forward. So those relationships just become very important. And as you spend more time in your position, you will have more of those relationships, and we could definitely see that happen over time. But think about those things. You know, you never want to tell someone it's a bad idea, because that never goes well, but here are our concerns, and why this might not be effective in what you're trying to do is probably the direction to go. But your constituent groups can definitely help you there. And if you walk in and help, you know, there are many times that we would help them get the right talking points in front of them so they knew what to say when they got there. And that, you know, we just couldn't say because of, you know, we weren't, you know, oftentimes we weren't permitted to be as direct as we would like to be at times. So I don't know about the others. I'm sure they have tips and ideas too.
Yeah, I will echo what Steve mentioned, is not using your in your stakeholder group, but like clearly sharing information that might not be beneficial or that can change the outcome of a bill, but letting them know your thoughts on it. And then that also brings up a good point, is do not wait until the session to actually have conversations with your stakeholders. Keep it up throughout the whole year. That way it's a lot easier to actually get a hold of them during the session, or they know you well enough to actually take your thoughts. So I wanted to add that to Steve's comments.
And I might add as well that I think this goes back to truly understanding what is the problem, be it real or perceived, that they're trying to solve with this bill. What are they getting at, and does it do that? Because then that makes you think about, okay, is there some other way that we might be able to address the concern? And that could be a regulatory fix, as Steve mentioned. It could be that it's alternate language that you offer. But do remember, and I think this is something that's a hard lesson for us as regulators to learn, is that this is politics. And so, as Pam mentioned, sometimes the bill, the purpose of it is to start a discussion. Sometimes there are other ulterior motives for introducing these bills. So just remember that sometimes you will encounter, and it will be frustrating to encounter bills that really are not good for the public's health. You know, they're just really bad bills, but you have to be able to just understand that sometimes the political process will fix that, whereas reason and logic and facts and science will not.
To what you all just said, and Kim, you mentioned public health. We've really had concerns with numerous bills where they were going to negatively impact public health in our state, and anything, in our state, anything shipped out or manufactured here. But what our concern was, we actually go to, and I'm with Virginia Department of Agriculture, we go to, we have a good relationship with the Virginia Agribusiness Council, Virginia Farm Bureau, and we go to them, and actually they help us. They actually get people to come, or they get groups to come to speak against the bill. They can do some things that we might not be able to do. So you want to have your stakeholder groups work with you if you really have true concerns. And we've all had our raw milk bills, we've had, again, I mentioned food freedom, or cottage food folks that want to make low acid canned foods in the home and not be inspected. So we've had concerns, and we want to take those concerns to the legislators, but it really helps to have these constituent groups, stakeholder groups that you have relationships with, where they can bring people to speak to the bill during the session.
Oh, anyone else? Okay, let's move to our next question. Has anyone developed and used a business plan to develop this fiscal info that they need from the agency? If so, do you have any tips on developing this type of a plan?
That's a great question, and I don't have a good answer. I have not. So that would be a great idea.
I think the closest I've ever come to that was when we did a comprehensive rewrite of our fee structure. Then it was much closer to a comprehensive business plan, and we actually switched at the same time from funding from the general fund to being fee-based. So it was a pretty comprehensive plan. And here's the impact of doing this, and here's much more so than some of the other proposals, but that was very much an agency type proposal versus a proposal of a constituent group.
What is the average time frame for legislation to get passed?
It all depends. Some you have bills that I'm just going to start that may take years to pass, that may come back for session after session after session because a particular legislature or constituent is very interested in them. And then you have things that suddenly end up getting inserted into something at the very last minute and have never seen the light of day until it's been inserted and basically passed within 24 hours. So it really can vary depending on who's responsible and what point in the session you're in. So it really varies. Understanding how your process works in your individual state will tell you more, but right. It's challenging.
I think in Alaska, our sessions cover 2 years. So it's important to understand, as Steve said, it's critically important that you understand what happens. So there are years where if the bill doesn't go anywhere, it's dead. And there are other years where it will come back and be resurrected the following year because that session is still happening and they're finishing up work from the previous session.
So I can also mention that, last year was a shortened session because of COVID, but we had 2 bills that were being worked on that involved our program. Neither one of them was our bill, but one was a kratom bill and one was an egg bill. And we expect those to be brought back up again this year. And, depending on the way that the language is written inside of the bill is when a bill would start. So it's all part of that language as well. But then just as Steve and Kim has mentioned, there are times issues are up each and every year, but like it is always voted down or not worked, or it passes one side, but like not the other. So it could be years or it could be 3 months. So.
Okay.
I think also that goes to companion bills as well. Those may move more quickly if you've got a bicameral setup in your state, which some states do not.
Especially at the sign and die or the actual last day of the session, just when like people are trying to actually sneak in things inside of a budget bill.
Absolutely. That's another good point. Analyzing those budget bills that end up with policy language in them is really important those last days. While you still have a chance of potentially influencing it, but if you aren't paying attention and something gets inserted, you can be stuck with it. So really watching those last days and last hours are very important.
Okay. All right, this is a good question. In your experiences, how much detail or justification, like cost, breakdown, et cetera, is typically required when establishing a new fee?
I'm just going to say a new fee or a change in fees, a significant amount. You're going to have buy-in from lots of different levels in both agency administration and legislature. So even getting permission to propose it, you're going to have to do a lot of background work. Estimates. I can think of one one package that I did that it was literally the background analysis was hundreds of pages by the time we were done. So, it's just really going to depend on how much you're doing. If it's one isolated fee, it'd be far less, but you're going to need a fair amount of justification to get it moved forward. And advocates. I mean, all the way through that process, you're going to need advocates. One thing that we talked about during the budget webinar, if you haven't had an opportunity, is getting to know those key people in your Office of Budget and Management, those fiscal analysis, the legislative fiscal analysis people, getting to know those folks, because if you have a good relationship with them and you're known as being straightforward with them, they're more likely to say to the legislators and the administration, hey, yeah, this makes sense, type things. So, getting access and getting to know those people becomes very important. So take a look at the budget cuts webinar. There's a little more information there, but a fee increase is going to take a fair amount of background information. And, just because you aren't successful in year one, fee increases and fee changes and new fees, you should assume that's a 3 to 5 year project. Year one is probably never going to be it. One other thing to think about is if it's an election year, fees typically are less likely to pass in election years. Just you have a better likelihood in non-election years of moving a fee forward in most places. I've done both and I've had success in both, but oftentimes there's not, and literally I can tell you for a period of time, the legislature had an informal policy. They were only going to take so many fee increases forward a year across the whole state. And so they were very strategic about that. So, getting to that priority list sometimes will take a period of time. So think about it. Fee increases and ads are challenging.
Add too that it kind of depends on your structure in your state. For example, in our state, our fees are set by our regulation. We still answer to the purse string holders when there are questions, when their constituents contact them and say, what the heck, I don't want to pay this fee. So it does depend on that as well. But I would say probably you have more justification if someone else is bringing it forward on your behalf.
I would like to add on to Steve's comment, to actually be careful and answer the question that's asked. If they're asking for a total amount or a total fee, only give them that until they ask for a detailed listing. That way, fighting over or debate over a certain line item inside of your budget is not talked about during the session. We can look at the total fee, and then if they have further questions about that, then provide the actual information needed.
Okay. Pam, this is a quick one for you. Did your state approve non-service animals to be allowed in food service spaces?
They sure did. So, and it did cause a conflict between us and health. So right now in all of the wineries and microbreweries and distilleries that we inspect in Virginia, the dogs are allowed to be in there. They didn't have to be on a leash. It was very interesting when it was passed. There were no restrictions, but they can be in those tasting rooms. And where the problem is, again, we have some wineries and microbreweries where we inspect a certain portion of manufacturing, and then we have Virginia Department of Health, the restaurant, and you have the tasting room, but then you also have the restaurant. So it's been an issue, but yes, it was passed. It was passed.
All right. All right. Well, there are a couple of questions about budget cuts and things like that. And because we are short on time, what I'm going to let you know is that we are going to share with you after this webinar within 24 hours a link to our previously recorded webinar, and it's titled Best Practices for Handling Budget Cuts. It is just a wealth of information. We had a lot of really good feedback from that. We've developed some resources to go along with that we think will be beneficial. Include those in this webinar so that you can reach out and to us if you have more questions after you've reviewed that. So thank you guys for answering the questions. So what I'd like to do in closing is thank you for everyone for joining us today, and certainly thank all of our presenters for being here. The email is going to come in 24 hours, and you're going to have a recorded version of this webinar so that you can share it with others if they were not able to be part of this. In addition, we're going to have the slide presentation that you can use. We also have a one-page resource that we're going to share with you. It's just really quick about, Legislative Analysis 101. And we are including a link to the legislative drafting materials that for every single state, and that's on the National Conference of State Legislature website. Feel free to take a look at that, particularly for your state if you're looking for that information. And we are going to share again the information from the National Conference of State Legislature websites. It's where you can go and look at bills that have passed, not passed, or in between, primarily for previous years, for things that may be going on in your state. It might be a great opportunity for you to flip in there and see if other states have had anything related to that that might be able to help you out. So again, don't forget to watch out for the Legislative Process 101 that's going to be coming soon. And we want to thank you so much for participating. We hope you all have a great day.